Hi everyone. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here today. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really enjoying my visit and the beautiful Taipei. So today I will talk about characterization of giant exoplanets. I will focus the talk mostly on interiors, but I will have also a few slides on atmospheric characterization as well. Let me start by telling you a little bit about my team, because the work that I will present was done by many people in my team. So here you have a picture of almost everyone there. And we are working on exoplanet characterization in general, not only the giant planets that I will focus today, but we also work with rocky exoplanets. And also with interiors and atmospheres. I'm very interested in understanding basically how is that planets work. So as I said, today I will focus mostly on this part, on the giant planet part, but if you are interested in knowing more about the rocky planets, I'm happy to discuss later or tomorrow. Okay, so because I know that there is a very interdisciplinary people sitting here, let me tell you first which are the main questions in the field of exoplanets. So exoplanet is a relatively young field. The first exoplanets were discovered 30 years ago. Actually, this year is 30 years ago. So there are many questions that we still don't know about these planets. And the most interesting one for me is that we still don't know how is it that planets work, in the sense that we don't know very much about the interior structure, about the connections with the atmospheres, about the atmospheres themselves, and what can we say from the other big question, that is, how is that they form and evolve. And of course, planet formation is also a very big field. I know that here there is a lot of people working with protoplanetary disks, for example, that are one important part to understand how planets form. But the planets are the other end of the puzzle, right? On the one hand, we can see the initial conditions of the planet formation in the disks, and on the other hand, we can see the end member, the planets themselves, and both are important to try to put the picture together. But of course, looking at the planets themselves is not enough, because they also evolve with time. So we need to understand how is that they evolve with time. So then we can see, okay, we are observing this planet, what is it telling us about the formation? For that, we also need to understand how is that planet evolved with time as well. So I think all of these are really the biggest questions in the field, and some of the questions that I'm particularly very interested in. So during this presentation, I will talk a little bit about both. And the first one about planets' work, I will talk mostly about what do we know about the interiors of giant planets, and how the material is distributed in these planets, and what lessons we learn from our solar system giants as well. And then to discuss a little bit about evolution of planets, I will mostly show only a few slides about the atmospheric evolution. So then you will get an idea of what when we observe a planet, what is really happening to that atmosphere. So let's start with the first one, with the interiors of these worlds. And for this, first I want to motivate a little bit more why we are interested, particularly in giant planets. These planets are the first planets that form in a planetary system. They form very quickly. They are really forming a few millions of years, which is very fast, as you know, in astronomical scales, because they need to accrete all the gas that they have before that gas dissipates from the protoplanetary nebula. And that happens only in a few millions of years. So they form really quickly. And because they have a special evolution in their interiors, different from rocky planets that have differentiation processes and other more complex modification of their molecules, giant planets don't have that, right? So they still have their primordial gas, in a sense. And that's why studying the interiors and atmospheres can give us clues about the formation of the planets and about the formation of the entire system. So this is really one of the reasons why studying giant planets is important, because they really hold some of the keys to understand the material that was really forming those systems. But they also affect a lot the entire planetary system, because they are the ones that hold the most mass. So if we look at our solar system, for example, more than 90% of the mass of all planets is locked in the giant planets. They really dominated the whole dynamics of the system, including the Earth. They dominated where the small planets are, where the big planets are. They dominated the movement of smaller bodies like asteroids and comets, and even potentially the delivery of water to our planet. So understanding what happened to those planets during their formation and evolution, this migration and so on, it's also very important to understand the whole history of the systems. I like to think of giant planets as natural laboratories, in the sense that they have in their interiors very extreme conditions that we can very rarely reach in the lab. And they push us to study some basic properties, for example, of hydrogen in pressures and temperatures that are very extreme. And we wouldn't study if it weren't because we are curious about these planets. So that's why, in a sense, I think that they are also showing us some very basic properties in our natural laboratories as well to study these things. They are also the easier to characterize. So particularly thinking now on exoplanets in particular. Because the bigger the planets, the easier they are to observe. And even though they are not the majority of planets, now we know that actually the majority of exoplanets are the smaller ones. But these are still the easier ones to observe and characterize. And that's why they offer, at this moment, right now, a very important opportunity to understand how exoplanets work. And finally, this is also a great moment to study giant planets, because we had two great missions to the solar system giants. We had the Cassini mission that was orbiting Saturn for more than 20 years and gave us really great information to understand the planet, the moons, the rings. And we also have right now still the Juno mission that is orbiting Jupiter and has been orbiting Jupiter since 2016, so almost 10 years now. And it gave us also very important information to understand these planets. So I will tell you just a little things about what we learned with these missions to understand the giants in our solar system. So these two are really the points that I will focus during this talk. Let me start first with our solar system. So, as I mentioned, we have these two missions, Cassini and Juno. I'm particularly involved in Juno, and it is still there. Juno is a NASA mission, and as I said, has been orbiting Jupiter for almost 10 years, and is doing a lot of science, not only the interior that I'm particularly interested in, but it's also studying the atmosphere, the magnetic field, and also the moons. So the last 4 years, I would say, we changed the orbit of the spacecraft that has now also orbited a few of the moons of Jupiter, and is also giving great information for future missions that will go also to the system. So Juno had a camera. Here you can see a nice time lapse created with real pictures of Jupiter. And the spacecraft was orbiting Jupiter every 2 months. And the time, only a few hours, was very, very close to Jupiter that you can see here. And this was really the time when we were taking the measurements. But that's why it also allows us to have these beautiful images of Jupiter that we've never seen before. And also images of the poles of the planet that we also have never seen before. So it was really, really an amazing mission so far. Okay, so what is it that we have learned with these two missions? So here I'm showing a schematic view of the interior of Jupiter. So this is what we believe today that the interior of this giant planet looks like. And you have different parts. So let's start from the outside inwards. So we have, the atmosphere is really a tiny, right? 1% of the entire planet. And this layer here also represents the whole atmospheric composition. So this is mostly molecular hydrogen and helium. And then when we go deeper into the planet, we have this region here that has droplets. What happens there is that hydrogen and helium, they just don't want to be mixed anymore. They separate from each other. There is an immiscibility happening there. And then helium forms droplets. These droplets rain down to the interior because they are heavier. And then we have a depletion of helium in the atmosphere of the planet and an overabundance of helium in the interior compared to the protosolar values that you would expect. And this is actually observed. So there was a probe that entered into the atmosphere of Jupiter in the 90s, and we measured this depletion of helium. So that's why we could pinpoint that there was something like this happening. So this actually, this immiscibility has been only very recently measured in the lab in 2023, but before it was only theoretical. So this is what I said, one example of why this is a laboratory for us. So theoretically, we knew this happened because we observed this depletion, and then we could only reproduce this in the lab in the last years. When we go in this region as well, there is also something else happening to hydrogen. So hydrogen becomes a metallic fluid, and this only happens in the interiors of giant planets. It doesn't happen in the interiors of stars, for example, because you need to have relatively cool temperatures for this to happen. So giant planets are partially degenerate. See, if you are working with high energy astrophysics, it's something similar to what you might find in for example, in pulsar stars. And that's why it's also complex to study the internal structure. Equations of state and so on need to be specially prepared for studying these planets. Now, when you go even deeper into the planet, you have at the very center the core, made of 100% metals. And then this region here is what we call the dilute core, that basically all the metals in the core are being dissolved into the hydrogen and helium envelope. And this is something new. We didn't know this before. So our picture of planet formation before Juno was that the planets first formed the core and then the envelope, and these were two separate things. But now we know that they are actually mixed with each other, and that also changes a little bit our picture of how giant planets form. One final thing that you see here is this dashed line, and this is telling us something about the circulation of the deep atmosphere of Jupiter. This is also something that we figured out with Juno. And is that all the bands that you see in Jupiter, they rotate even in different directions at different speeds, but they go only up to a few thousand kilometers inside the planet, so up to here, more or less. And then the rest of the planet rotates more like a rigid body. So this is also something that we could understand thanks to the gravity data that we got from the Juno mission. From Cassini, we also got a similar picture from Saturn. But actually Saturn we know a little bit better than Jupiter, because besides having the gravity data, for Saturn we can also do ring seismology. So basically both planets oscillate, similar to what happens with the stars. And then if you can study somehow those oscillations, that will give you information on the interior of the objects. For Saturn, we could measure those oscillations because they propagate to the rings. So studying the ring seismology in a sense, we could also infer the interior structure of Saturn. And it's very similar to what we know for Jupiter, but actually the helium layer, the helium rain layer is probably much thicker, and we don't even know if it extends to the center of the planet, which makes things complex because we don't know much about this helium rain. As I mentioned, we only measured it a few years ago. So this is, I think, one of the biggest questions for us also to understand what happens with the matter and the energy transport in the interiors of these planets. Okay. So just a quick summary. Basically, one of the important take-home messages that we got from these missions is that the interiors of these planets are inhomogeneous, meaning that before we believed that the whole envelope was convective and everything was well mixed, and then what we were observing in the atmosphere represented the interior of the planet. But now we know that that's not true, that there are some inhomogeneities. We have some gradient of metals going from the envelope to the center of the planet. And we also have other regions, layers, that are making our picture a little bit more complex. There were also planet formation models that try to reproduce all this information that we obtain. And here I'm giving a few examples, but there were many more actually. that are also forming these inhomogeneous structures from the formation themselves. So I'm also happy to chat more about that if you are interested. Now, let me move a little bit to what are the things that we are learning from exoplanets. And as I mentioned, exoplanet is a relatively young field. Of course, we don't have as detailed information for exoplanets as the one that we have for our solar system, but we have numbers, right? With solar system planets, we only have 2 examples, maybe 4 if you count Uranus and Neptune, although we know less of Uranus and Neptune than we know for some exoplanets, which is also very curious to me. But we do have lots and lots of them. And now with JWST, we are getting very, very impressive information. So here I'm showing the period of the planets around the stars and the mass of the planets. The different colors, it depends on the method that we use to detect them. You also see our solar system here that I put as a comparison. And you can see that most of the exoplanets that we are finding are very different from our solar system planets. And this is not because we are special, or at least we don't know yet if we are special. The thing is that these planets, our solar system, is very difficult to be observed for an alien observer, because the planets are very far away from the sun, and the closer you are to the sun, the easier it is to detect the exoplanet signal. So that's why most of the planets we are finding are very close to their star. It's a bias in our observations. And the first ones that we found were also very big, giant planets, because also giant planets are easier to be detected. However, we know these days that the most common exoplanets are not giants, are actually smaller. All right. So how is it that we study these planets? And this in particular, I'm focusing here on the part that I'm interested in, because there are many other aspects to discuss here. But one of the ways that we use to study these planets, particularly their atmospheres, is using the fact that some planets, not all of them, might pass in front of their stars when they are orbiting them. And of course, for this, you need a very special geometry, right? We are looking at the system, and you need the planet to be passing in front of the star. And this is only a very small percentage of all the planets. But when that happens, then the planets that are darker than the stars, they will block part of the stellar light. And in this way, we can detect that there is a planet around it. But also, some of the stellar light passes through the planet atmosphere, and then we can study that combined spectra and see which are the elements present in the atmosphere of that planet. So this is a technique, it's called transit technique, and it's really one of the most common techniques to study the atmospheres of these planets. Not the only one, but it's the one that we are using from space. And the reason why you need a space is because you are getting very few photons of your planet. You really need to have a huge precision, and the less noise, the less atmosphere, the better to actually get something out of these measurements. So we use this technique now for a long time. The first atmosphere around an exoplanet was discovered in 2002. So we've been doing this for 20 years, but using really telescopes that were not made for this. So we were using Hubble, we were using Spitzer. Those telescopes were not designed to do exoplanetary science. They were just happened to be there, and we used them, and we did what we could. But actually, now is really starting the era of studying atmospheres of exoplanets with JWST that was developed with having this science case in mind, together with other science cases, of course. But it was also thought to study exoplanets, and that's why it's really creating a huge revolution in our field. So here you see a nice movie of the James Webb ensembling itself on space. That for me is just something amazing that we can do. And it's amazing that it worked and it didn't fail. Because all the things that could have gone wrong are very big. There is actually a documentary about that if you are interested. But anyway, so this is a comparison of the mirror of the Hubble compared to the one of James Webb. You see the huge comparison, right? The amount of photons that we can collect with this thing have no comparison to what we could do before. But even more, with the Hubble, we were observing more visible light, and the planets actually shine with their own light more towards the infrared. They are cooler objects. So really, James Webb is much better suited for us than any other telescope before. Just to convince you how amazing it is, this is a nice movie made by Hannah Wakeford. Here you see the data that we had before JWST for a giant planet called WASP-39b. And you see that we only had these 2 points. I think they were Spitzer. And with these, we had to kind of guess what the atmosphere was made of. But now we have something like this. And even better, I would say, because this was just with one orbit, with one transit. If you combine more and more informations, you get smaller and smaller error bars. So you see now why this is really changing the field of studying atmospheres of exoplanets. Here is a nice example of one of the planets that we know the best, that is WASP-39b. And you see that we observe it with all possible instruments and modes in James Webb. And you see here the different spectrum. So these are all transmission spectrum in the sense that they are looked from the planet perspective, so they are not absorption features that we are seeing, but rather when you see a bump, this is telling you that an element is present in the atmosphere. And that's why you can see, for example, this bump here is CO2, here you can see some water, here you see CO2 again, and this is a nice example of Shami's paper that actually is showing this nice feature, SO2. When we observed it, we just had no idea what it was. And then we figured out that was sulfur dioxide. It's the first time that we detected sulfur in an exoplanet atmosphere. And you can also see how this species is telling you something about the whole metallicity in the atmosphere, the whole amount of metals. So these models are models showing different amounts of metal, from a very low metallicity to a higher and higher metallicity. And you see how SO2 is a very nice tracer of that. And the reason why I'm showing this is because for studying interiors of planets, we are really interested in knowing our boundary conditions. And the metallicity in the atmosphere is one of the key boundary conditions to understand what happens in the interior of the planet. So that's why these kind of measurements of sulfur are very important for us. Okay, so to add to what I showed you before, besides the information we obtain from our solar system, the information we are getting from planet formation models, and we are also getting great data from JWST now. So we are putting all of these together to try to understand interiors of planets. This is very difficult. The best way to study the interior of a planet is either having a seismographer or going and orbiting around it and measure the gravity field. We cannot do either of those. So we really have to work with the things that we have to try to understand what happens in the interiors of these worlds. So these are the kind of models that we were using for interiors of exoplanets. Until now, I would say. They are very simple. They say that your planet has a core made of 100% metals. It has an envelope, mostly hydrogen and helium, and also some metals. And it also used the common assumption that what you observe in your atmosphere represents the entire interior, because basically the material will be convective and everything will be well mixed. This is what we use until now, right? There are even papers that still use this very simple picture. And the reason why we were using this was first because we didn't know any better, not even for solar system planets. All the things that I show you for Jupiter and Saturn were recent developments, only the last few years. And second, because we didn't have any other observational constraints to help us to make these models better. We only had masses and radius. And with only two key information points, we couldn't tell anymore, right? It's a very degenerate problem. Now we are trying these other kind of models that we call inhomogeneous. And these ones have this mix of metals, this gradient of metals from the 100% metals in the core and they go diluted in the envelope. These are more complex models, more realistic if we think that giant exoplanets might form in the similar way as Jupiter and Saturn. We don't have all the extra layers that I showed you before because we just don't know if they exist or not for these planets yet. We just don't have enough information on phase diagrams, we don't have enough lab measurements, we don't even have numerical calculations to tell us if this helium rain, for example, might happen in these planets or not. So this is all relatively new for us, and that's why we move on to more complex models, but still a little bit simple compared to what we have for solar system planets. And the added complexity of these tell us that what we measure in the atmosphere is not really representing the entire envelope of the planet. So this puts extra complications also to understand how planets are forming and evolving. One other, before that, so what we do is really, we do MCMC calculations. So we start with some constraints like the mass, the radius, atmospheric metallicity, atmospheric temperature, abundance of helium, and for this we also have to make some assumptions about the stars. Then we use an interior model. So the way that you model the interiors of planets is exactly the same as how you model the interiors of stars. We even use the same codes. The difference is that they don't have nuclear reactions in their interiors. So the way that planets get their energy is that they are gravitationally contracting during their entire lives. And so we use similar models. And then we do millions of calculations to see which are the outcomes, like let's say the interior structure of the planet that can reproduce the initial constraints. And with that we obtain mass of metals in the different layers and the core mass of the planet. So this is more or less the simple approach that we use. Let me show you one example. So one test that we did was to try to understand if really the atmosphere was helping us to constrain the interior or not. And here you see we were trying to extract the core mass of a planet that we built. We knew exactly which was the core mass of the planet. It was very similar to Jupiter actually. So we took a simple Jupiter model, and we tried to use our method to retrieve the parameters of Jupiter to see if the method worked. And we used only the radius and the mass of the planet to see what we could find. And basically we couldn't find anything. So the core mass is this dashed line, and you see that these are all the solutions we obtained, because using radius and mass is very difficult to constrain anything. When we added extra information, like the atmospheric metallicity and temperature, and also helium abundance, then we could very nicely retrieve the core mass of our test planet. So that's how we know that actually atmospheric metallicities are helping us to understand more the interiors of these planets. And another constraint that we can use is what we call log numbers. So what happens is that exoplanets are very, very, very close to their stars. And because they are so close to their stars, there is a huge tidal interaction between the planets and the stars. And some of these planets are very deformed because of this effect. And we can measure, in very extreme cases, the deformation of these planets. There are different ways of doing that. One of the ways is actually in the transit itself. So here you see, this would be the blue, the transit of the transit light curve of a spherical planet. If your planet is more oblate, then you see how it changes a little bit the transit, but also the entire phase curve, the whole light of the planet orbiting the star. So in some very few cases, we can use these to measure log numbers. We have done this for 5 exoplanets so far, and those are the ones that we know the best, because then you are adding an extra constraint to understand the interior. And because it's also a tidal parameter, it's equivalent in a sense as the gravity data we are getting for solar system giants. So it's very useful. We've used it for 5 planets. Here we first tried to understand if it was useful or not. So we did the same exercise I told you before. we just took a test planet that was our Jupiter planet that we knew exactly what had in each layer. We tried to retrieve the parameters of that planet using different observational constraints. And here you see, focus on this part here, what we could obtain of the, let me see, what was this? This is the metallicity of the entire planet, and this is the core mass. And you see how, in this last part, when we have the atmospheric metallicity and the log number, we can retrieve the core mass and the metallicity much better than with all the other cases when we didn't have that. So log numbers are particularly useful for finding core masses with very small error bars. And this will also be very helpful for planet formation models, because they would like to know which is this critical mass to trigger really the gas accretion. So I think this would be very useful information to have in the future once we have more numbers. Now we have this for very few planets. Okay, so just some examples. Here are the 5 planets for which we have log numbers. This one is the one that the log number is the smallest. Actually, the error bar is so small that it's even better than the one we know for Uranus and Neptune, which is very surprising to me. But the planet is very deformed, very close to the star. This one here is the second best, HAT P13b. This one, we measure the log number with a different technique. It's more related to the dynamics of the system, because the system has 2 giant planets, and then there is a precession created in the orbit that we could measure. So it's a slightly different method. For this one, though, we don't have any atmospheric measurement. We never observed it with any telescope. And this is why I'm PI of a James Webb proposal, because I propose to actually observe the atmosphere of this planet. I have observers in the team, of course, that will help me to deal with the data once it arrives. But I'm very excited to know more about that. We will get the data next year. So here you have the core masses and the atmospheric metallicities of all these 5 planets as we retrieved with our method. And you can see here also Jupiter and Saturn as examples. So Jupiter the green and Saturn here in orange. And you see also we still have big error bars, because even though we get metallicities, we get log numbers, we have some more information of the mass and radius, we still have large error bars and big degeneracies. But we are getting there. Hopefully also masses and radius will improve as well in the future with other missions that we are also having coming soon. But I won't give you any extra information. Okay. We are also retrieving some other parameters actually. Here I'm showing this dilute core part. So what happens with this increasing of the metallicity for the planets and how that might happen. But this is also having big error bars, because it's very difficult to know when this dilute core starts, how is the slope of this compositional gradient. And what's even complicates things more is that if your gradient of composition is too large, then that might inhibit convection, and then the way of transporting energy becomes more complex, and we don't know very well what happens then. So we would also need luminosities to actually understand the evolution of those planets better. So that's also work for the future. Okay, so before I move to the few slides I have on atmospheric evolution, just a wrap up of this interior part, and is that we learn from solar system giants that giant planets are complicated, much more than we thought so. But we now have a very nice picture of Jupiter and Saturn's interior structure and evolution as well, that is also helping us to understand other planets. We are also getting information from planet formation models. We have atmospheric metallicities and log numbers that are really helping us to constrain these planets better. We don't have lots of statistics yet, so with James Webb we observed a few tens of planets. After all the observations are made for the 5 cycles that we have so far, well, 4 plus the 5, the 5th one, we will have more than 200 exoplanets observed, which is great, and is starting to give us some statistics. But not all of them are easy planets. Not all of them are giving us metallicities with small error bars. Sometimes it's difficult to get that number. So this is really a work in progress, but will definitely improve in the future. And what the first things that we are finding is that actually the cores of these planets are quite large, larger than we expected, more than 25 Earth masses, but they are also very large planets as well. But this is something that, that hopefully we will get more in the future. Okay, so let me now spend the last minutes of the talk telling you something about the atmospheric evolution. That is also something that is very interesting and also affects the interiors of the planets as well. And basically, the reason why I'm interested in this is also because I want to link what we observe in the planets today with their interior and with their formation. But most of the exoplanets we are observing are very old, billions of years old. So they already evolved for quite some time. And it's very key for us to understand if what we are observing today represents the primordial planets or not, and how is that happening? What happens to the planets in the middle? How do the atmospheres change? So this will really help us to understand what we can say really about planet formation. Many of you work with this, so you might have heard this idea of if the planet forms in different places in the disk, then it will have different amounts of water or CO2. But of course, if the planets evolve with time, if they lose some of their material, how can we tell that the water that we are observing is the same as the primordial water that the planets had? So this link between the planets and the protoplanetary disks is not right if we are missing this very important link with the evolution of the atmospheres. So how is it that these atmospheres evolve? Basically, what happens is that you have a planet, your planet has an atmosphere, the planet is heated, very intensely heated, because they are very close to their stars. And what happens is that this energy that they receive is exciting your molecules and your atoms when you are very high, and they basically escape. They get enough kinetic energy that they can escape your planets in many cases. This is, of course, a very simplified explanation. If you want to know more, actually, you have Miguel here. You can ask him more about atmospheric escape. But basically, that's the simple idea, right? The planets receive a huge amount of irradiation, X-rays, UV, and all that transfers into your molecules. They are excited. If they get enough energy, they can escape your planet. This is very important for planets that are so close to their stars. It's also happening to the Earth right now. Our planet is at the moment losing its atmosphere. But it's very little the rate, because we are very far away from the star. But actually, during Earth history even, this is just an anecdote, the models say that our atmosphere was much, much, much thicker. 2,000 bars was one of the models I've seen, and it lost a lot of the atmosphere during the evolution of the planet. So this happened to our planet as well. But it's particularly important for exoplanets, and we are seeing this. We observe the gas escaping. We observe these tails, these cometary tails that the planets have, because the atmospheres are escaping. So it's something that is very important for these worlds. One thing that we did was to try to see, because the lightest elements are the ones that escape easier, the heavier elements might remain, but you also have a huge flux leaving your planet, right? So it also drags some of the metals as well. So we did some calculations to see how this evolution, this escape of the lightest elements was affecting the metallicity of your atmosphere. Remember, I'm interested in the metallicity. That's why this is my bias. We did this for a giant planet, for WASP-39b, our famous example. And here, what I'm showing is the enhancement of metallicity in the atmosphere with time. So this is the evolution of the planet. You see that the enhancement, if you look at the numbers, we started with 1, and at the end, after giga years of simulations, we had 1.2. The enhancement is very, very, very little. And that's because this planet is a 90 Earth mass planet. So it's kind of like a Saturn. It has a huge gravity. So then it's more difficult for the molecules to escape. The planet can retain its atmosphere much more efficiently than smaller planets. We did a test with a smaller planet, and we tried what we call a super Neptune, basically a 30 Earth mass planet. And you see that here there is a really enhancement of the metallicity. So this is where we started. And you see that at the end of our simulation, we have an enhancement of some elements of 60%. It was a huge enhancement of some of them, of course, of the heaviest. The heavier one is iron. You see that carbon managed to escape more effectively than iron. But this is just an example for one planet, of course. Every case is different. But this is showing you that you have not only an enhancement of metals, but an enhancement of some metals more than others. So also the C2O ratio changes with time, which is also interesting for us that we really like to measure carbon to oxygen ratios. Okay. So another interesting thing is that planets also, the spectrum of planets also evolves with time because the atmospheres, the metallicity in the atmospheres evolve with time. So we did some snapshots of what would be the spectrum of this planet at different ages. And here again is this transmission spectrum. So the bump is telling you that there is an element present. And you see that at the very beginning, the planet had a lot of, I think it was a lot of methane. So yes, the red one was methane here. But it loses the methane very quickly. You see, it was only at the beginning and here, and then you don't see methane anymore, because the hydrogen is the one that escapes the easiest. But then you have other things appearing, like CO2. This peak here, his CO2 was also there at the beginning, but it became more and more pronounced as you are losing your hydrogen. And other things like SO2 also appears only at the end when your atmosphere is more and more enriched. It's not that these elements appear, it's basically that hydrogen leaves and then your chemistry changes. So this is also interesting to think of the different spectrums of planets at different times. Okay. I think with this I will move to our take-home messages, and I hope you have lots of questions. So first, about interiors. We are starting to understand interiors of these planets. But of course, this is, again, a very young area of research, so stay tuned. Hopefully, we will have more information and statistics to show in a few years. We are also studying the atmospheres and the evolution of these atmospheres. The next step for me is, of course, to combine these two things and try to see how this evolution of atmospheres also affects the evolution of the interior of the planets. And as I mentioned before, I haven't done all of this work by myself, but I also want to thank my collaborators, especially Sane, Esther, and Amy, that were the ones leading all the work that I showed today. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, any questions? Shami, please.
Thanks for the great talk, Yamila. Yeah, very comprehensive and accessible. My question is about using log numbers to constrain the planet's interior. How sensitive does log number depend on whether you have a diluted core or not? Have there been modeling calculations on this?
Yeah, it's very sensitive because your log number changes between 0 and 1.5. And if you are in one extreme, all your heavy elements are concentrated in the core. And if you are on the other extreme, all your planet is very well mixed. So basically, it's even telling you directly about the core. That's why it was so interesting for us to understand it. Yeah, but the problem that we have with log numbers is that right now, there was, I think, only one measurement, the one that I showed, done with James Webb. All the others were done with previous telescopes, and the error bars are huge. So we cannot pinpoint much information until we observe them with James Webb and we get better error bars.
So genetics, these error bars should do the work.
Yeah. Yeah, we even did the calculation. You need a precision better than 40%. And we don't have that yet for many planets. We only have that for 2 cases.
So if you have dilute core, and that means it's easier. Sorry, less easier to be deformed. Is that fair to say?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because people don't understand those numbers, so I should.
It has to do with how compressible
The compressibility. Yeah. deformation.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Sorry, related question. So could you remind me what's the observational signature for measuring the log number?
It's basically that because your planet is deformed, your light curve will look different than the one for a spherical planet. So what we observe is the planet passing in front of the star, and basically how deep this signal will be depends on the area of your planet divided by the area of the star. So if your planet is deformed, that will change the signal. It's very small though, it's very, very small.
Oh, would that be teacher with the size, the intrinsic size of the exoplanet?
Yes, also, yes.
I'm wondering what's the mechanism of the metallicity evolution. So is there any external source or only the change in the planet interior?
So what we did is a very simple model. We basically were escaping the hydrogen and assuming that the flux that was escaping the planet was also dragging our metals, and the heavier ones were staying behind depending on their mass. So this is a very simple approach. A better approach could be to study the evolution and escape of each one of these species individually, but to be honest, we don't know much about that. Those are very difficult MHD calculations. So work in progress for people doing that, not me.
Thank you.
But that sensitive, is that sensitive to initial condition? Because if you have a puffier,
Yeah.
then
It
it's easier to escape at every time.
Yes.
So can you comment on this?
Yeah, it's sensitive on the initial conditions, not only on your planet, but your star evolves as well. So depending on the type of star, how active your star is, how much X-rays and UV your planet receives, if the planet has a magnetic field or not. There are many, many things that might complicate this picture. Yeah.
So is there any mass function estimation of the planets, like stellar mass, initial mass function peaks around 0.6 solar mass? Or planet, is there any such derivation? And after GWST observation, is there any change of that mass function?
You mean if you change?
Like stellar mass function peaks around 0.6 solar mass, right?
Of the
Initial
stellar mass.
function.
Yeah.
Yeah, for planet, is
Yeah.
there any similar kind of derivation of?
So we were very biased so far in the planets and the stars that we were observing, because we know that we have planets in our star. We were focusing on stellar masses. Most of the searches were very biased to G stars. We are now also doing it for M stars and K stars because we want the stars to for a long time to actually have stable planetary systems. There are also now some searches going to F stars, and I even heard about A, but we don't have comprehensive statistics because the searches are very biased everywhere. So there are some teams trying to unbiased and get some information and statistics of this, but I think it's still very difficult, yeah, and very early. We just need more information.
Yeah.
How does the diluted core scenario rules out the formation first of a solid core and then?
Yeah, so there is this also dichotomy in planet formation models. If they are different if you have planetesimals or if you have pebbles. So it also changes depending on that. So basically in the planetesimal scenario, you first form your core and then you start accreting gas when you have your critical mass to start the gas accretion. But in this image, you accrete solids and gas at the same time. So then what happens is that when your envelope is growing, your solids are also growing, and they fragment and dissolve and create these inhomogeneous structures. On the other image, on the other picture, is slightly different because basically you form first your core and you start accreting your gas, but your pebbles are being dragged and falling into your planet until your planet is very big. It creates a pressure bump in your disk and traps all the solids there. And then it's more difficult with that picture to create these dilute cores because you just don't have an inflow of solids as effectively anymore. So this might also tell you something about these formation processes as well, and that's why it's interesting for us to know how big these dilute cores are, how much they extend into the planet, and of course how they evolve with time to know the primordial conditions of planets. So that's how they can help with.
So how does it evolve with time? Is it sustained by any mechanism or is going to
We don't know very well, so there were only a few papers dealing with that because this is very new, all of it. But the idea is that you have your dilute core and your envelope on top of it that is convective is eating your dilute core, let's say, and getting more and more material to your envelope. So the dilute cores should shrink with time and your envelopes should enrich with time. That is the standard picture that we know. But you need very special conditions for this to be very inefficient in a sense and not eat your entire core with time. So we are still studying which is initial entropy, which are the energy considerations that you need, but there are a few papers that came this year, but it's very new. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, sounds like a good time to stop. And we just remind you we have tea and coffee over there. So right after this, and then you're welcome to speak more questions. And with that, and then thank Yamila again.
Thank you.